I have spent my entire career fighting for justice, but I never thought the most important battle of my life would be right on my doorstep. I am not a confrontational man, but when they tried to take away my son's right to exist, when they used their power to force us to leave, when they dared to touch Bailey, Ethan's guide dog, I knew I could not stand by. They turned from meaningless warning letters into a war. They spied, slandered, manipulated the entire community, but they targeted the wrong people. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting content. I stood by the window overlooking the quiet streets of Willow Creek Estates, where I had chosen to start a new chapter with my son. Austin, Texas, with its old oak trees and secluded neighborhoods, seemed like the perfect place to find some peace. After all that had happened, all I wanted was a safe environment where my son Ethan could adjust to his new life without anyone watching or feeling sorry for him. A year ago, an accident took Ethan's sight. I still remember the moment the doctor came out of the operating room, his eyes heavy, his voice low, as he announced that my son would never see this world again. I was used to facing heavy verdicts in the courtroom, but no verdict was more painful than that. A boy who was once full of energy, passionate about sports, had to learn to survive in a world that no longer had a shape. I lost my wife when Ethan was 8. And now I had to watch my son lose an important part of his life. But I refused to let despair overtake us. I had taught Ethan the power of justice, of resilience, and now it was my turn to help my son rebuild his future. Bailey came into our lives like a miracle. He was not just Ethan's eyes, but also his hope, his bridge back into the world. When Ethan first put his hand on Bailey's soft fur, I saw his shoulders relax for the first time in months. When he led my son to take his first steps without holding onto a wall, I knew he was more than a dog. He was part of our family. Bailey was more than a pet. He was my son's eyes, his independence, his faith in life. I did a lot of research before choosing Willow Creek Estates. The community had everything I wanted: a quiet place, good security, a great school system. When I first brought Ethan here, I saw his face relax a little, as if he sensed that this might be a safe place. The realtor emphasized that the community was extremely close-knit, that the residents took pride in the orderliness and strict management of the HOA. I didn't tell them I was a federal judge because I didn't want favoritism or special treatment. I wanted Ethan and I to be seen as any other family. We were just a father and son looking for a home. The first few days here went smoothly. Ethan took his time getting used to the new space, testing his first steps on the sidewalk with Bailey. I watched quietly from a distance, my heart sinking as I watched my son regain some of his lost confidence. I began to believe that we had found the right place to start over, but little did I know that even as my son struggled to move forward, eyes were watching from the shadows, waiting to push us back into the place we had just escaped. A world of prejudice and injustice. The early days at Willow Creek Estates were supposed to be a new beginning for our family. I had chosen the place in hopes that Ethan would regain his lost confidence, an environment where my son and Bailey could live without judgment or pity. But I was wrong. 3 days after Ethan took Bailey for his first walk alone, a white envelope was quietly slipped through the door. Violation notice, unlicensed animal, fine, $750, immediate removal required. I clenched the paper in my hand, a simmering anger rising. Bailey was no ordinary dog. He was my son's eyes. I responded immediately, attaching Bailey's legal service certificate, hoping it was just a minor mistake. But Catherine Monroe, the HOA president, didn't care. A week later, another letter arrived, more bluntly worded. HOA rules have no exceptions. Failure to comply will result in enforcement. I began to realize this wasn't a mistake. This was a fight. From that day on, the stares from the neighbors became heavier. Conversations abruptly stopped when Ethan or I appeared. Curtains fluttered every time my son walked by. Mysterious phones were held up from windows, recording Ethan's every move as if he were a threat. Then the new rules came. All pets had to be DNA registered. All animals outside had to be muzzled. Residents with special needs had to submit monthly medical records. No one had to comply except us. The tickets kept coming. Each one had one goal: to force us to leave. 3 times animal control knocked on our door saying they had received complaints about Bailey being a dog. 3 times they had to leave without finding any evidence. But each time, I watched Ethan shrink back. My son no longer walked out the door with the confidence Bailey brought. Every morning he sat quietly in his chair, his hand tight on his leash, his eyes unfocused. He understood. I understood. They didn't just want to get rid of Bailey, they wanted to get rid of Ethan. The climax came one afternoon at the community pool. Ethan tried for the first time to join the other kids, but Catherine Monroe appeared, her eyes sharp, her voice full of authority as she ordered, "With your condition, you need supervision at all times. That's the rule." Ethan stiffened. I saw his fingers clench, his shoulders shake, but he didn't protest. He just kept his head down, walking quietly, with curious eyes and whispers fading behind him. I've spent my life fighting for justice, but I've never had to fight for my own family. Now, I know it's necessary. I know this fight isn't just about Bailey, it's about Ethan, about his right to exist, about his dignity. And I swear, I won't let them win. I've stood in the most important courtrooms, faced the most sophisticated lawbreakers, but I've never seen a fight like this. Silent, cold, and calculated. After the pool incident, I knew Catherine Monroe and the HOA weren't going to stop at warning letters or judgmental looks. They wanted to isolate us completely. The next day, I noticed new surveillance cameras had been installed, all pointed at my house. The lampposts that had once provided mere illumination now had lifeless mechanical eyes, watching Ethan and Bailey's every move. No other family was being watched like this. I checked the HOA's bylaws. There was no provision for monitoring residents without their consent. But I was not a regular resident in their eyes. I was an outsider. The accusations about Bailey continued to surface. Every morning I saw concerned looks, parents pulling their children away as Bailey and Ethan walked by. "That's a dangerous dog," a child whispered to a friend, echoing what he had surely heard from his parents. Bailey, in his perfectly legal service vest, walked beside Ethan in perfect order. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he just did his job, guiding my son through a world that had turned its back on him. But Catherine Monroe didn't stop at rumors. A week after the pool incident, the HOA held an impromptu meeting titled Protecting Community Safety. I wasn't notified, but a letter mistakenly delivered to a neighbor's house revealed the meeting's real agenda: to discuss dangerous animal control in the neighborhood. That morning, while I was in court, Ethan called. His voice was shaky, mixed with the background noise. "Dad, someone's here. They say Bailey attacked a child." I heard Catherine's voice on the phone. "We can't risk the safety of the other children. Bailey has to go." I ran out of the courthouse as fast as I could. By the time I arrived, a crowd had gathered in front of the house. Bailey was being dragged by the police toward the patrol car. Ethan collapsed on the grass, his hands reaching into the air as if trying to find the certainty of the world that had been ripped from him. "That dog growled at my son," a woman called out. A boy stood behind her, his head bowed, avoiding my gaze. "Bailey would never do that." Ethan's voice was weak, but no one heard. Catherine Monroe stood in the center of the crowd, arms crossed, eyes triumphant. She didn't need proof, didn't need reason. She had already instilled enough fear to get the crowd on her side. The officer checked Bailey's service vest, but he seemed hesitant. I took a deep breath, fighting back my anger. "Do you have any proof?" I asked. The officer avoided my eyes. There were no bite marks, no wounds, no witnesses beyond empty accusations. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about the law. This was about power. Ethan reached for Bailey, but the leash was already pulled from his grasp. I saw his shoulders hunched, saw him sink into the same despair he'd felt the day the doctor told him his eyes would never see again. And that was the moment I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I've seen injustices in my career, but I never imagined I'd be standing in front of my house, facing police trying to confiscate my son's guide dog. The way Catherine Monroe manipulated the situation, controlled the crowd, fabricated the accusation, it was all carefully planned down to the last detail. She not only picked a time when I was busy in court, but she also prepared an HOA meeting in the name of protecting the community and made an accusation that was unfounded but had the power to instill fear. I walked over, took a deep breath, and tried to calm myself. Ethan sat on the lawn, his face in a panic, his hand reaching toward Bailey but touching nothing. My son had lost his sight, but now they were taking away the only friend who made him feel safe. The officer stood by the patrol car, one hand holding Bailey's leash, the other thumbing through a file that I knew contained nothing but a baseless accusation. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no bite marks or any other sign of an attack. There was only Catherine Monroe's word, and in this place her word was enough to convict. "That dog growled at my son," the woman next to Catherine said, her voice breaking when she saw me looking at her. A boy hid behind her, his eyes averted. I could see the fear in the boy, a fear not of Bailey, but of what he was being forced to say. I turned to the officer. "Do you have any evidence of assault?" My voice was low and sharp, but he didn't answer right away. He knew who I was, and he knew I knew the rules better than anyone here. I saw him hesitate, saw his hand tighten on the pen, knew he was wondering if he really wanted to continue being a part of this game. But Catherine didn't give him a chance to hesitate. "We can't wait until we have a real victim," she announced, her voice loud enough to make the crowd nod in agreement. "A vicious dog doesn't have to bite to be dangerous." I looked down at Ethan. My son's hand was still outstretched in the air, searching desperately for Bailey. My heart sank. Catherine Monroe didn't care about anyone's safety. She just wanted to witness this moment, the moment Ethan lost his faith in the world, the moment she could look at me and know she had won. But she was wrong. I relaxed my shoulders, took the leather wallet from my coat pocket and opened it slowly, deliberately. I saw the officer stiffen as he recognized my badge and card. Federal Judge Jonathan Reeves. "Officer," I said, my voice steady but firm, "are you aware that seizing a certified guide dog based on an unsubstantiated allegation can be a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and result in civil charges?" He swallowed. The crowd began to whisper. I wasn't just dealing with an abusive HOA, but a community that was slowly realizing it had been manipulated. Catherine blinked, her lips tightening as she saw the situation slipping out of control. She was used to power, to giving orders that no one dared to challenge, but this time she had the wrong target. I walked to the patrol car and opened the door. Bailey jumped out, running straight for Ethan. My son collapsed, wrapping his arms around Bailey, his relief breaking into sobs. Catherine tried to salvage the situation. "You can't use your power to bully this community," Her voice was harsh, but it didn't have the same certainty. I turned to look at her. Bullying? I smirked, but my eyes were cold. You tried to use the system to destroy my son, and you think I'm going to let you do that? Without waiting for her to answer, I pulled a USB drive from my pocket. Here is 3 months of evidence of systematic harassment, abuse of power, and discrimination against a disabled individual. I handed it to the officer, looking him straight in the eye. I want to file a formal report now. No one spoke up. No one came to Catherine's defense. The crowd began to disperse, one by one, silently leaving, with the belated realization of what they had unwittingly helped to accomplish. I reached down and put my hand on Ethan's shoulder. My son was still holding Bailey, his body shaking, but not with fear, but with relief. I knew this moment would change everything, and I knew, too, that this fight was far from over. I had seen faces like Catherine Monroe's before, people so accustomed to power, so convinced of their own invulnerability that they thought they could make their own rules and force others to obey. But they always made the same mistake, believing that no one would dare challenge them. As Bailey slid out of the patrol car and ran toward Ethan, I saw my son clutching him as if it were the only thing holding him to the world. The police were still standing, the injunction papers unsigned, the crowd murmuring, and Catherine Monroe realized her plan was no longer working. I could see it in the way her lips pressed together, her eyes darting around as if searching for an ally, but no one was on her side anymore. I stepped forward, slowly but firmly. I had spent my career identifying abusers of power, and I knew the exact moment to strike. I didn't need to raise my voice. I needed the truth, and the truth was on my side now. Officer, I want to know what procedure was followed before you attempted to impound a legitimate service dog. My voice was low and sharp, not a question but a warning. He flipped through the file, his hands hovering over the meaningless pages. I'd seen that hesitation 100 times in courtrooms, the sign of someone who just realized he'd made a mistake. There's no evidence of assault. No witnesses, no wounds, no medical reports. The only thing you have is a resident's accusation with a clear personal motive. I didn't need to look to know Catherine was stiffening. I took a step forward, slowly pulling my badge from my pocket, unfolding it so everyone could see. I am Federal Judge Jonathan Reeves. The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. The surrounding eyes shifted from disbelief to shock. I didn't have to say anything more. I could see the change in the officer's face, the shock, the realization, and most importantly, the fear. Did you know that denying a disabled person access to legal accommodations is a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act? AD8? My tone didn't change, but I saw him swallow. And using the authority of an HOA to fabricate and harass a disabled resident can be considered a federal civil rights violation? No one said a word. I remained silent, letting my questions sink into the consciousness of everyone present. Catherine Monroe was the first to break the silence. You cannot use your power to threaten this community. Her voice was sharp, but not as firm as before. I turned to look at her. Catherine Monroe, who was used to running the HOA like a private kingdom, was facing a force she could not control for the first time. You think I am threatening? I tilted my head. No, I am simply reminding everyone that the law does indeed apply, even here. I pulled a USB drive from my pocket and held it between my fingers. Inside is 3 months of evidence of systematic harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power by the HOA against disabled residents. I handed it to the officer, looking him straight in the eye to make sure he understood its significance. I want to file a formal report now. No one objected, not a single one. Catherine Monroe stood still, her face draining as she realized the inevitable. she had lost. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to threaten. All I had done was expose the truth, and the truth had destroyed her. I turned, crouching beside Ethan. My son was still holding Bailey close, his fingers clutching the soft blonde fur as if it were the only thing left he could trust. I put my hand on his shoulder. "We're not going anywhere." I didn't have to look up to know that some eyes were wavering, some neighbors wondering for the first time if they had chosen the right side. Catherine's game was falling apart, but I knew this was only the beginning. The fall of a small empire always begins with a crack, and I saw the first crack in Catherine Monroe's face as soon as I revealed myself. She was used to absolute power in this neighborhood, used to everyone bowing their heads, obeying without question. But this time, no one looked away. No one pretended not to see. I could feel the change in the atmosphere as I handed the evidence to the policeman. The heavy silence was no longer Catherine's weapon. It became hers, as each of the residents around her began to question it. About the rules, about the warning letters, about the things they had accepted without ever daring to question. And then senior resident Helen Davidson was the first to step out of line. "For 3 years I've been fined for letting my grandson visit more than twice a month," she said, her voice shaky but firm. She said that children disrupt the grown-up atmosphere of the neighborhood. I saw Catherine blink, trying to keep her composure, but I also saw her fists tighten. She had controlled the HOA for so long that she had forgotten an important truth. People only shut up when they believe no one is there to defend them. But now, they're not alone. A man stepped forward. "We were refused a safety fence around our backyard to protect our toddler. Catherine said it was unsightly." Another woman. "She fined us for having a birthday party with too many guests." A couple. "We have 2 foster children. Catherine wouldn't let us sign up for community service. She said the HOA had the power to ensure uniformity in the neighborhood." Voice after voice, each piece of the puzzle suddenly coming together to form a picture of a hidden tyranny. A system built on fear, sustained by silence, and now collapsing under the weight of its own injustices. Catherine Monroe stood there, alone in the midst of the community she had once ruled. She still tried to control the situation, but no one was listening. I didn't need to say another word. The people who had been afraid had found their voices, and Catherine knew the game was up. When a regime falls, it does not fall in a single moment, but in long stretches of silence. That was what I saw as Catherine Monroe stood among the crowd that had previously obeyed her orders. But this time no one bowed. Eyes that had been avoided now looked straight at her. Voices that had been silenced now spoke without hesitation. I knew the game was up, and more importantly, Catherine knew it too. The HOA held an emergency meeting that night, a meeting she would have controlled in the past, but this time she was just a spectator. Faces that had supported her turned away, and allies who had been silent were now the first to make accusations. I didn't need to say anything more. I just sat there, listening as one person after another stepped forward and recounted years of oppression by a system they had not dared to challenge. I saw neighbors I had thought indifferent, now standing before the crowd declaring that they would not let this go on another day. A petition was presented to dissolve the HOA, and unlike previous votes, there was no opposition. No one wanted to maintain a system that had been twisted to serve personal interests. Catherine Monroe did not wait for the vote to end. She stood up, her face stony, and turned to leave. Without a word of justification, without a backward glance. But I knew this was not the end for her. Because when a regime falls, it does not just lose power, it has to face the consequences. I was prepared. 3 months of documentation, evidence of discrimination, systematic harassment, and violations of federal law. The following week, the formal complaint was filed with the Federal Fair Housing Commission and the Department of Justice. What Catherine Monroe had done was more than a power play. It was a serious violation of U.S. law. When the notice of the federal investigation arrived, I knew Catherine realized that this battle was out of her control. Faced with multiple civil lawsuits and the possibility of prosecution, she had no choice but to resign. But her departure did not mean things would automatically get better. The collapse of the HOA left a power vacuum, and that vacuum needed to be filled not with a new system of control, but with real community. A new residents' council was formed, not to impose meaningless rules, but to rebuild what had been broken. Those who had been silenced were now empowered to decide their own futures. I sat on my porch that night, watching the lights of the neighboring houses. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel eyes peering through the curtains. I heard Ethan sitting next to me, his hand gently stroking Bailey, his breathing more even than before. I didn't have to look to know that for the first time in months, my son felt safe, and I knew we had won. The collapse of a system is not the end, but the beginning of something new. Willow Creek Estates, once a community run on fear and control, is being transformed. There are no longer invisible walls separating people from each other, no longer rules designed to serve only the powerful few. For the first time, the community is run not by coercion, but by solidarity. What happened was not forgotten. The rifts that Catherine Monroe had created in the community would not disappear overnight, but for the first time those who had been silent began to speak up. A new council was formed, not to impose harsh rules, but to protect the rights of all residents. They did not want to repeat the same mistakes. Within months, change began to happen in unexpected ways. People who had been scared by HOA threats were stepping up to fix what was broken. A group of residents volunteered to organize community events again. No barriers, no segregation, no unspoken rules about who's allowed to attend. Children played in the park without looking around nervously, and seniors were no longer punished for grandchildren visiting too often. And at the center of this change, Ethan was leading the charge. I have watched my son emerge from the shadows he was once thrust into. From a boy who cowered in fear, Ethan has found power in his own story. The 16-year-old boy Catherine Monroe tried to erase now stands before the community, teaching about disability rights, about equality, about how we can make the world a better place just by speaking up. Ethan organized a disability rights awareness program right here at Willow Creek Estates. It was a small initiative, but it quickly spread, engaging more residents than ever before. Children learned how to interact with people with special needs. Adults learned how to redesign their living spaces to be inclusive. The community that had turned its back on my son now stood by him, listening to what he had to say. Bailey, the dog once considered a menace, has become a neighborhood mascot. Children who were taught to stay away from him now flock to pet him and learn to interact with a guide dog. Ethan is no longer traveling alone. He is traveling with an entire community that has been transformed by his story. And perhaps the most dramatic change comes from the most unlikely place: real estate. What Catherine Monroe once warned, "Difference will drive down home values," has turned out to be a lie. Willow Creek Estates is recognized as the most inclusive and welcoming community in the area, attracting those seeking a truly welcoming environment. Home prices have risen not because it is sustained by exclusion, but because it is built on inclusion. Late one afternoon, I stood on my porch, watching Ethan and Bailey lead a group of kids on a walk around the neighborhood. The sunlight was golden on the trees and laughter was everywhere. There were no more questioning eyes, no more phones raised to monitor. Helen Davidson, the woman who had been fined for bringing her grandchild to visit, walked up to me. She smiled, her eyes filled with emotion as she took in the scene before her. "Willow Creek Estates has changed," she said. I nodded, still watching my son. "Not just this place," I replied, "but the people here.